Okay, welcome back, guys. So this is part two of our chapter 6 video. We left off in part 1 by going over this diagram, this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So just as a refresher, remember that aggregate demand is total demand. You can think of that as like total spending by government, by households, and by foreigners purchasing our exports. So that's really what makes up aggregate demand. Anything that affects people's total level of spending will affect aggregate demand. Short-run aggregate supply in general is really total output, total production. It's basically the same thing as real GDP. It's how much stuff is the economy producing. Maybe what I forgot to mention in the last video is that the aggregate supply curve is still a supply curve, just like we learned in chapter 3. Supply curves are really determined by the cost of production. So things that change cost of production for businesses will, for businesses in general, will shift these aggregate supply curves. Okay, so for most of this video, I'm just kind of going to run you through some examples of things. So this is going back to the classical view. Remember that the classical view of capitalist economies is that they are naturally stable, that they always kind of tend to find their way back to equilibrium, and therefore there's no need for the government to intervene and do anything to manage the economy. So a picture of how that would work is here. So this is how the classical economists would have explained the Great Depression. We start out at this point at equilibrium where supply and demand meet. Something happens to make people afraid, make them nervous, so people and businesses stop spending. So that reduced spending reduces aggregate demand. So aggregate demand shifts to the left. So we go to this blue demand curve and the red dot. So there's this new short-term equilibrium where we're in a recession because you can see that output has declined and prices have decreased. Before long, according to the classical view, these reduced prices and reduced wages will lower production costs for businesses, and that will cause businesses to increase their supply because as things get cheaper to produce, they can make more of them at any given price. So the aggregate supply curve, short run aggregate supply curve, shifts to the right. Now we move from the red dot to the green dot, and now we're out of the recession. We're back at our full employment, back at equilibrium, albeit at lower price levels overall. So that's what the classical economists expected to happen during the Great Depression. If you believe this, what should the government do about recessions or inflation? Nothing, because the economy is always going to fix itself. As we saw in the Great Depression, though, this didn't happen. So Keynes came along and explained it basically this way. The key here is this idea of price and wage stickiness. So he says, okay, yeah, aggregate demand decreased, we move back here. But economic theory tells us that as demand decreases, prices should drop and wages should drop, and that's what allows the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift back to the right. But in reality, a lot of businesses are very resistant to reducing their prices, and there's sometimes it's just hard to do. For example, a simple example, if you're a restaurant and you've printed up menus with all your prices on them, well, it's costly to print new menus and change all those prices. Another example is there are a lot of labor unions back in the 1930s that had contracts and they demanded a certain wage for a certain period of time. It was very hard for businesses to go and say, hey, we have to cut your wages. People weren't going to stand for that. So prices and wages that are supposed to fall many times really don't. So instead of that short-run aggregate supply curve shifting us all the way back out and getting us out of the equilibrium or out of the recession and back to equilibrium, it might only shift a little bit. So we move from this dot to this dot, but we're still in a recession because we're way below the output level that we should be at. So that idea of price stickiness and wage stickiness is really one of the key contributions of Keynes. Keynes eventually showed us that what really brought us out of the Depression was spending for World War II. So, we're way down here in the recession of 1940. 1941, we start prepping for war, and the government starts spending a lot of money. That increases aggregate demand because government is a component of aggregate demand. So by 1941, we were back about to full employment, full output. Further defense spending as the war really ramped up in 42 pushed us up into inflationary gaps and beyond our full employment level. I think I mentioned in the last video, it might seem strange to think that long-run aggregate supply is sort of full employment or full output, and that we can go beyond that. But World War II is a perfect example of that. You know, what was considered full output in 1941 meant that men went out and worked, and a lot of women stayed at home and raised kids, and they weren't in the labor force. But during World War II, a lot of the men went off to fight in the war. We still needed people to run factories and do jobs around the country, so women came out of the labor force. A lot of children did too. Kids dropped out of school and went to work. So that's how we can get beyond kind of that normal level of full output. We went beyond that by pulling these people that weren't in the labor force into it. A lot of minorities too were unemployed, and then all of a sudden the racist factory owners said, hey, you know, we'll employ minorities if we have to because we need people to work. So anyway, this compares a couple of views here. So we're going to talk a lot in coming chapters about the money supply and monetary policy. The government can manipulate the money supply to kind of manipulate the economy. But the new Keynesian views on the left, the classical or new classical views on the right. So in the new Keynesian view, here's the way of changing the money supply to work, an increase in the money supply. We start out at point 1 down here. The government can do things to increase the amount of money that's out there and available to spend. If they do that, it should make sense that aggregate demand will shift to the right. There's going to be more spending. That will, for a time, push us out to a higher level of output, such as Y2. So that's an example of how the government can stimulate the economy and get us out of a recession if necessary. Eventually, even the new Keynesians admit that money supply or those increased prices will become cost of production for businesses and cause the short-run aggregate supply to shift back to the left, moving us back to point 3. So Keynesians do argue for a more active role for government, but even they will admit, hey, these things only work for a short period of time. In the new classical view, remember their key contribution is this idea of rational expectations. So what they say is if the government increases the money supply, instead of moving out here, the rational expectations theory says that whatever the government does to affect the economy will instantly be perfectly understood by everyone in the economy, and they'll just adjust their expectations accordingly. So we never move here, we move straight up here. So they're saying that all increasing the money supply does is cause inflation. I find that hard to believe. It's hard to believe that if you put more money in people's hands, they're not going to go out and spend some of it and buy more stuff. But I guess the root of the idea is that if you give people more money, they understand, hey, this is temporary. Next year or so, there's going to be inflation. Things won't be as good, so I better save this money for those bad times, something like that. I find that a little hard to believe, but that's basically the idea. Okay, last slide here, just some practice to get you ready for your exercises. Explain the effects of each of these events. So 1 says government purchases increase. So your first question here is, does this affect aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply? Well, this is a component of total spending. Government purchases are part of total spending, so that's aggregate demand. So this would cause aggregate demand to shift to the right, which would push up price levels and push up real GDP. 2, the Fed sells bonds. That's a tricky one, and we'll talk about that a lot later, but bonds are something that you buy from the government, but then you have to hold on to them until they mature. So bonds you can't spend. So you've given away some money that you could have spent in exchange for something that you can't spend. So that's going to decrease aggregate demand, decrease total spending. Oil prices rise. That would be a supply shifter. That's something that changes the cost of production because almost everything in the economy is either made with oil or transported with it. So I'm just about out of time. I'm going to stop it there. Hopefully you can figure out number 4 for yourself. And I hope this has helped you understand Chapter 6 better. Thanks.